Welcome to Founders Friday. This is where we tell the story of awesome founders building great companies. This is a conversation for everyone that touches the revenue pipeline at their company. We hear directly from founders and CEOs. We also hear from their revenue leaders, and we learn from their experiences on how to build a revenue pipeline. Our goal is to educate while we entertain. So have some fun with it. Keep your responses punchy, and definitely share your secret sauce. That's why everybody's here. My guest today is Venkat, founder and CEO at Duplo Cloud. Venkat has worked in engineering roles throughout his early career, and then he went on to start Duplo Cloud, and we'll learn about his story on how that happened and learn a little bit more about what Duplo Cloud does. Venkat, thank you for joining this Founders Friday webcast with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Venkat, let's start by learning a little bit about you. So tell us about, I know you grew up in India, whereabouts in India, and what sort of your early life looked like?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Delhi, and that's where my parents were. My father was working in the engineering services with the government. So we sort of grew up in a very civil services kind of a culture, central Delhi, capital city. So, but I'm originally from Madurai, south of India. And then, I think that's where I grew up. I went to school there. I went to college over there, and I started working in a company called Siemens, like in the networking area. That's where I got first introduced to computer networks and so on. Then came to Chicago for my master's. And then after that, found my first job at Microsoft. And then
hold that thought though. We want to hear a little bit more about that transition from coming out from India to the US. So first, let's just stay with that India story for a little bit. So what's your favorite place in New Delhi? Where did you like to
I think I would basically say India Gate would be my favorite place. Because we used to live pretty close to that, and we used to go there and play mostly cricket and stuff. So I think, and then also, I mean, that's also like the heart of the country's political activity with Rajpath and South Block and whatnot. And especially since my father was in government, so we used to visit a lot of those official buildings and whatnot. So definitely it was like the power center. So
you were at the heart of the political center of government in India. And clearly a beautiful neighborhood. So that's pretty awesome. So let's talk about your transition from India Gate to Chicago. How did that happen, right? Like, what was that story, and what kind of prompted you to try to come out to the US and learn, get into what? And by the way, what kind of school? Like, engineering, business?
Yeah. So firstly, I think having grown up there, and especially one is Delhi with parents working, for the government, you sort of like get a sense of like working through adversities, basically, right? I mean, and that's generally true, right? In many government organizations and stuff, not that I was working, but I could see my father, his colleagues and stuff like that, because they're like all sorts of challenges. They're very different challenges, they're like sort of people challenges, basically, right? Like, how do you work through an organization and then you sort of like make a difference, so to speak, right? In a sort of an honest way. So that I think was a setting that I sort of grew up in. And then I was always like sort of prepared for challenges and sort of like, okay, you deal with it, and you're not given all the best of the resources, but you have to sort of make do with whatever you wanted. So in that sense, I think it was sort of like inculcated, like with all the surroundings, with my friends, father's friends, and all that kind of stuff. So then I think I didn't really have any intention of doing my master's. I was pretty content. I went to college in Jamia Millia, and then I started working for Siemens. This was the Siemens group, which was doing telecommunications. And then our job was to go all over the country and then sort of like set up the first mobile network in India. This was in 2001. So I spent a lot of time in Bombay. I spent a lot of time in Calcutta and all that kind of stuff. So sort of also, at that point of time, I had a lot, like being a city boy, I had a lot of experience working with all facets of people. On one hand, you're an engineer, you have a very white collar job, but at the same time, you have to go visit the sites in the remotest of the villages and whatnot to take the telecom network over there, and then you have to work with all sorts of people and whatnot. So that happened. And then I think seeing we were given devices and equipments, which we had a good knowledge of how it was working and whatnot. But that sort of like piqued my interest into how those are actually built. Like how are those routers built? How are those systems built and whatnot? Because I would have my sort of inputs and whatnot, but you are sort of capped in your capabilities because all the R&D happened in Germany for Siemens. So then that prompted me that, okay, maybe I should go and get a master's degree, which would give us an opportunity to do that, because at that time, software was there. I mean, services, a lot of services was being done in India. There was not so much of R&D. There were like hardly any startups, and telecom definitely not. Everything was done primarily in Europe. So then decided to come to US for a master's.
So that's what
we
your career started with the telecom revolution in India. And that, of course, is a well-known story at this point. Over a billion users on that platform. Right. And hardware, right? So more on the hardware side rather than software. And so that's a pretty significant transition from where you started to where you are today. So let's talk about that in steps. So let's start with your transition to the US. And I know you said Chicago. So tell us a bit more about that. What did that look like?
Yeah, so Chicago, I came to Illinois Institute of Technology to do my computer engineering. So interestingly, although I'm actually a developer, spent a lot of time developing and also built the product, but I've actually never sat in a computer science class ever in my life, which probably speaks of the fact that computer science is probably not that, or programming is not that hard. I mean, end of the day, it's some while and for loops. So yeah. So I came to Chicago.
We'll pretend our engineers did not hear that.
I think they should be encouraged. I mean, it's not like that hard, right? I mean, I know there are like all sorts of fancy algorithms and whatnot, but they're mostly available. But yeah, we'll talk more about that and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, I came to Chicago, started my master's in computer engineering, not in computer science. There, I think I was focused in networking, like the protocols, the L2. So like, for example, I think the career progression was pretty interesting. Like in Siemens, it was like hardware. It's called that SDH and PDH layer, the lowest layer of the networking stack. Then came to Chicago, and then I started working on multicast routing protocol. That's between like L2 and L3 protocols. And I spent, I almost thought that I would start to do a PhD, but then I think I finished my master's over there and then decided to apply for a job. And then a certain researcher in Microsoft, I was able to communicate with them, and they had a research group which was doing Wi-Fi, some stuff around Wi-Fi networks. Interestingly, that research group went on to become Azure.
So that's the story for how you got involved with Azure in this day. It's actually one of the things I was very curious to learn about. The cloud now, at this point, everybody takes it for granted. It's like turning on electricity or getting water in your faucet. But that's not the case when you and I started our career. So tell us a little bit more about that. And I heard you say, as we were talking about this interview, that you failed every FANG interview. So there is for people that fail their FANG interviews. So let's talk about that for a second. How did you land from Microsoft?
Yeah, I know. I think I just got lucky. The person, I had like 5 interviews. I was banking on my research background and the work that I had done. And fortunately, they gave enough weightage for that and they ended up hiring. So anyways, when a hiring manager hires me, and after some time, I tell them that, look, dude, I'm your most reliable employee because I'm not going anywhere. Because if I have to interview, I doubt that I'll pass. So I was at Microsoft. I spent like almost 8.5 years over there. I started first, I think, this MSR group doing Wi-Fi stuff, and then spent about a year or so in Windows Phone, again in networking, and then again the same sort of that group was doing Azure. So then they hired me in Azure. I was writing the compute stack. I was fairly good at programming in the sense that, so when I joined Azure, there were, I think, only about like 20 or 30 odd engineers. We all started writing the compute stack. There was no networking at that point of time. And then me and my manager went on to create the first network networking group in Azure, and then there was a group in Immersa which sort of invented SDN, and then I helped implement that SDN at the commercial grade, and then that went on to be called whatever. And then that's how.
Venkat, I think a lot of us are going to be curious about, in the early days of Azure, what was the vision for what Azure was going to become? Like, obviously, I'm sure it's evolved over time, but was the vision consistent with where it is today?
Yeah, I think so. I think I would, in my opinion, in my sort of humble opinion, I think the vision was set by Amazon. Right. I mean, I think Amazon had already started public cloud like a couple of years back. And I think we all sort of knew. And then, but then what Microsoft had was that there was a gentleman called Ray Ozzie. And then he sort of said that, we have to move on from Windows, the laptops and devices, to cloud services. So in that sense, I think Microsoft had a broader vision of the cloud, in the sense that they envisioned delivering end-to-end SaaS services in the cloud. Whereas like what Amazon was doing was they were delivering infrastructure as a service in the cloud. So in that sense, I think when the Azure group was created, in some senses, I think very initially we made a mistake that we ended up starting with PaaS, a platform as a service, in which we said, hey, you know what, if you want to adopt cloud or Microsoft Cloud, you have to rewrite your application based on, how we prescribe it. And then you have to start from there. Whereas Amazon was saying that, you know what, just here, storage, compute, network, just shift it and move on. I think that was one of the core learnings in the first couple of years. And it was also, how as an engineer, you sort of learn that, okay, you have this huge potential in a business, and now you have to sort of like change things underneath it while the system is working. So we sort of ended up building infrastructure as a service on top of platform as a service, which in technical terms was like rather difficult to do, but we had to do that, and then we were reasonably successful there.
Very, very interesting. So I'm going to fast forward a few years. Okay. So, I mean, clearly, like, you started out in the heart of cloud land at Microsoft, and then, a couple more engineering roles, and then led to founding of Duplo Cloud. So tell us about the origin story for Duplo Cloud, and what sort of prompted you to think about moving from, working for other companies to starting your own?
Right. Yeah. So I think first, there are two parts to it. One is, I think, the tech part of it, as in like what you're trying to do in the tech and so on. And the other is that, okay, how do you, as a person or as in your mindset, you start to become an entrepreneur and so on. So from the tech perspective, I think in Azure, what at least I sort of learned is that, how you started with 20, 30 engineer managing maybe 100 servers, and then we grew it to a few million virtual machines. And even then we had only a handful of people. And we thought one engineer dealing with 50,000 workloads, latest of compliance and whatnot. This is life. This is how things work. We have not heard of DevOps. We thought, you're a dev, you deal with ops. That's it. If anything, across the pond, we had Amazon, who were like 8 times bigger than us, and maybe like with half the people. So that was that. And then I left Microsoft to actually join another company that was eventually called NCME, that was acquired by Cisco. And then we also moved from Seattle to the Bay Area. But for the first time, I saw what non-cloud world looks like, because I had this weird career, I think, for that time, wherein I had not seen like an on-premise data center, right? You start with like Azure cloud kind of a thing. So then I think I was sort of like a little bit first surprised that every 50 VMs, they had like 1 or 2 people to manage it, to get to SOC 2 PCI. It used to take people like 6 months to 12 months. And this is like people who are not just on-prem, even people who are operating in cloud. Then we're like, okay, what's going on? Then people said, oh, there are no DevOps engineer. I was like, what's DevOps, man? You are like dev, you deal with ops. So then they were like, no, this is not DevOps. It's not that. DevOps is like, okay, you are an operator. You learn to write code and then you become a dev. It's like, oh, obviously that makes sense. I think there are challenges over there. That led to say that, okay, whatever we did in creating this infrastructure as a service, I think there is a possibility to do something similar on top of that, another abstraction, and create a DevOps as a service. And I think being in Microsoft, which in my opinion is the world's largest platform company, right? I mean, they build platform for 1 billion people, doing as a service things came very naturally to us. Like, we are trained to do that in Microsoft. Like, you do something, they're going to be used by 1 billion people. Don't break it, right? Like that sort of a thing. So we said, okay, I think DevOps as a service is possible. So that was the technical part, basically. So, but I was not that founder who sort of said that, okay, I'm going to build $1 billion company and change the world. I thought, okay, if I go back to my job, let's say someplace which, like I told you, was really, really hard. I've failed like multiple interviews by then, right? I'm like, okay, I have this job which pays me like 350K, 400K, sometime like in that time. I need to build something which will pay me that much, basically, right? So I wrote this code and then try to sort of like reach out to people and then build a product around that and build a business. So that was the starting goal, and that's what started Duplo Cloud.
Okay, so this is super interesting because I think you kind of had this unique perspective on the cloud before most people did, even in Silicon Valley, and that's what shaped your thinking for what led to Duplo Cloud. And then obviously the Microsoft platform influence. But how did you make that transition from, hey, I'm working for these companies, they pay me well, to where I'm going to put all that away and set it aside and take the risk and jump in and we'll see what happens? So I mean, it's a big mindset shift.
Yeah,
so
interesting.
What led to that?
Yeah, interestingly, I think I didn't take any risk. I'll put it that way. So I'll tell you why I didn't. Because the way this worked out is that I had built a version or a substantial amount of this software in my own time. And a friend of mine was running infrastructure at a company called Zenefits, which at that time was a rocket ship. Yeah. So I was just talking to him, like, when you fail interviews, you have to find someone who just hire you without that, right? So like that sort of stuff. So then I asked him, hey, dude, what's going on? And he's like, I'm trying to hire 10 people to do my DevOps. I'm like, why do you need 10 people? He was with me when, in Microsoft and Azure. It's like, this can be done much lesser. He's like, no, you don't find those people and whatnot. I said, you know what? I have a software. Why don't I actually work? I'll just work for you, use the software, but let me keep the IP, pay my salary, right? And then he was paying me like whatever, the reasonable Bay Area principal engineer salary. So that's how it sort of got started. So the software was there. They were like 75 engineers. My goal was to not have any other DevOps engineer, and then they should be self-service. So that was like sort of this dream job. The software was in place, people were using it, working it, and it really got baked and whatnot over a period of time. So that's how it started. And then, like, that's what I was trying to say, right? I think I was making like 200K or something. I was like, if I can push it to another 100, 150K, then I'm like sort of doing well. And maybe I may not have this job because that company was not doing very well. I need to get new people. So then with that context, I thought that, okay, now it's time. So let me take this product, and I think I should be able to go and sell it to other people. Then there's another story of how you start selling from being an engineer to suddenly being a salesperson and whatnot. There are my own learning.
Hold that thought. Well, that is a big part of our conversation today. I'm sure a lot of people are curious about that. But you touched on something else. You bootstrapped this company for a number of years. It wasn't until recently that you actually raised your first significant.
That's right.
So, I mean, obviously the origin story sort of lends itself to a bootstrapped model. It seems like you sort of, got your first contract. You already had the product in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And so that kind of led to, just adding incrementally, I imagine. But tell me a little bit more about that. And at what point did you decide, and how long has it been since? At what point did you decide, like, now it's time for me to go raise money? And why is that?
Yeah, I think the company was sort of like, I think we raised our first round in 2020, but I'll tell you how it sort of worked out, right? So having built that product and having some people actually using it gave me the confidence that this really works and all that kind of stuff. So I was very excited at that point of time. Then I actually went on to people, and incidentally, I went on to IT people and DevOps people and sort of tell them that, look, you know what, this software does all of this. But I mean, first, I didn't have any validation. I didn't have really like a lot of connection, but the people saw it as that, well, I'm already doing this. This is DIY. Why would I use your product, kind of a thing, right? So in that sense, there was some dejection. But then one consistent message that I was sort of getting is that, software aside, will you work for me? So what I really thought is that I think definitely people trust people, in the sense that there is a there is a shortage of subject matter expertise. It's also easier to basically sort of like sell people kind of a thing. So what I sort of did is that I registered myself in Upworks as a DevOps engineer for, I think, $19 an hour or something. And I said, like, you need a DevOps engineer, I'll work. And then fortunately, one gentleman actually picked it up. And then I went to him, I said, look, yeah, this is what my background, but by the way, this is the software. You just pay me like a fixed price. And then I'll take care of this DevOps stuff, basically, right? And then he's like, you don't have to worry about the software. I'll deal with your engineers and they'll use it and whatnot. And he was like, how much would you charge? And this was the time when I was fighting for $500 a month, basically, of product licensing based on the number of nodes. I said $2,000. And he said, oh, that's great. Let's do it. And I was like, man, this is crazy, right? So then I put the software over there and that worked out. And then he actually referred me to another particular person, another, I was a second customer. And then there was again like, okay, same story. Like basically, this is the software, how does it, but don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. So then she was like, okay, you know what? I can only afford $5,000. I'm like, awesome, great, right? So then I think we sort of started the business. It was almost like a services company hiding a software into it. But at the end of the day, there is like, okay, they know that this person is sort of there who will take care of it and whatnot. And then we were able to build a few customers, like about 8 or 9 customers. And because the price point was so high, because at the end of the day, software did work, basically, right? I was by myself and I had like 9 customers. And I think our revenue was maybe like 400K or something like that.
So you hit the goal that you were looking for.
Yes, I hit the goal that I was looking.
400, yeah.
Yes, exactly. But it was selling. It was selling more. And by that time, having all the software and everything, once you have a little bit more resources, you also get a little bit more confident and basically say, look, this is the software company. This is what it is trying to do, sort of, right? So and then I think we made that sort of like messaging transition. It was always the same software. And
first 10 customers, how long did it take? This approach?
I think it took about 2 years, 1.5 years.
1.5 to 2 years.
Yeah, 1.5.
Starting with, you already had the product. And at this point, like, typically you have 10 paying customers. You have enough feedback, sort of whether you have product market fit or not. So did you feel like you had already established product market fit?
Yeah. So the thing is that I'll be very honest, right? I mean, I didn't know what that meant. The only time that those kind of conversation happened is when someone you're talking to a VC and you're trying to raise money is like, okay, product market fit. And like one of my, like I was encouraged by people to go actually and raise money, right? And then the normal question is, okay, when will you hit 100 million in ARR? How big is your TAM? Like I was like a deer on a headlight kind of a thing. Like, I mean, 100 million, I like no clue. I mean, like, I don't know when I'll hit like 100,000 in MRR, right? What do you mean 100 million and so on, like product market fit and so on. But I would tell you, this is how it sort of transitioned. I think I had transitioned from an engineer to somebody who could sell, in the sense that you put me in a room in front of someone, I can be persuasive, I can be very technical, and I can sell. But I was not obviously the person who could actually go and build a sales team and, have all those metrics, pipeline, like basically reaching out to people and so on. And that's when sort of like Ian had come in. Right. So when we were about like, I think 700 or 800K in ARR, we were very fortunate to find Ian. And then Ian is actually a salesperson, for example, right? I mean, he's a VP of sales. He hired people, he built those relationships and so on. And then he put a structure to that process, basically. And then I think by end of 2020 or early 2021, like from 2018 forming the company to 2021, we hit our first million. And then Monta Vista and Venkat came in. And then he was one of probably the only a couple of VCs who sort of did not ask me a path to 100 million, which I'm very fortunate, right? And then I sort of like went from there. And I think there was another challenge, is that the team was a big problem, in the sense that people always sort of said that, okay, what team do you have? Like, we didn't have any rock stars. And I myself, I mean, I had a few check marks in terms of Microsoft and Azure, but I didn't have a lot of people. Ian was new and so forth. So, but Venk was, I think, sort of was nice in the sense that he didn't give enough weightage to that much. He looked at the product more. And one of our advisors was also, I think, a partner over there, Job. And then he sort of like, we got in, basically, right?
Got it. Very cool. Yeah.
So that I think sort of started. And then I can talk about like how the Series A and everything else went.
But hold that thought again, Venkat. So, you touched on the fact that you made the transition to a sales role, and
Right.
then, of course, Ian coming on board. We worked with Ian very closely as Duplo being our customer, and I feel like he definitely brings that structure and that methodology and the process and all of the key things that are necessary to help a
Right.
sales team scale up. Now, at what point did you realize that you didn't have necessarily the strength to sort of, or the skills to sort of scale this up yourself as a sales leader, and you need to bring somebody in? And I think more importantly, in our conversations, I heard you talk about GTM in a very different way than what I typically hear CEOs and founders talk about. So we're going to go there next. So, how did you make that transition and said, okay, I need to get somebody who's going to help me do this?
I think I always knew that I was not like
self-awareness.
Basic, right? I mean, like, I mean, imagine, right? This is a guy who wants to make like 300K, right? In salary. And that's what he sent out to be an entrepreneur. It's a very different kind of a mindset. It was really around, I think, when we really started doing well. I think Som is our advisor. I was, I think, very fortunate to be surrounded by good people. Right. And Valley is this, interesting place where even if you don't know a lot of people, if you start doing a little bit well, somehow everybody else finds you, right? Advisors finds you, lawyers finds you, customers find you and whatnot, right? I mean, it just happens in the city. Yeah. So I think that's when I think it happened very naturally. Basically, right? It was not like, okay, I put a rec out and I was like actively looking. I was just on my path to do what I was doing because, primarily because at that time, I didn't have any of those goals. I need to be 2x, 3x, 10 million, 100 million kind of a thing. I was like, okay, I need to grow. Fine. That's all it was. There was no VC. There was no pressure. And then Ian sort of came along and I had a decent vision. I mean, like sort of a thing. And then he wanted to start something from the scratch. And then that's when it started. And then when I think, when the investors came in, or maybe a little bit before that, we were able to put in those structures. And by that time, I'd already started understanding product market fit, go to market, scaling, and whatnot to some extent.
I think the key point you made is being self-aware as a founder on what you do well, how far can you take it, at what point you need to bring in somebody who can help carry the torch. Now we've been working with you for a few months now, and you've obviously had many conversations. You've given us great advice on our product and how we should be thinking about building it, et cetera. All the feedback that I've gathered from the conversations you've had with our team, with Aman, my co-founder, the few times we've gotten together, you come at it from a very different perspective, like thinking about sales and go to market, kind of more from a first principles perspective rather than how it's traditionally been done, which I think is a huge advantage when you're building your own business. But like, tell me a little bit more about how you think about scaling go to market from your lens, not necessarily the traditional sales motions that we're all familiar with, but just from your lens.
Yeah, so I think, and this has evolved over the period of time, right? Like, for example, especially after our seed round, I really understood, like, for example, what a successful business meant. Like, I mean, like, this is like, what $100 million business looks like, or what a $50 million revenue business looks like. What is a TAM? How do you approach it? How do you focus on, like, don't go and sell to everybody where you think there's a technical fit? You need to, like, narrow down things and whatnot. So I think that's the first thing, that you sort of like understand, as in like where your product is going to fit and whom you're going to go and sell to. And one of the things that I think I have learned in my particular journey is that you have to put yourselves in their shoes, like the customer's shoe, and sort of think, would I buy this? And more importantly, why would I not buy this? Basically, right? Like, so I think that's maybe you call that as like sort of the first principles effectively, right? So you go and sort of say that, okay, why would I not buy this? So weed out everybody who would not buy this. And you also have to be very conscious and understand their perspective. Just because you may perceive yours to be a superior technology doesn't mean that someone has to go and like throw away all the work. That sometimes there is a risk aspect of it, basically, right? They may settle down for something inferior than for something that is perceived to be superior, but for example, untested, for example. So the first thing is to identify your market, identify your buyer. and try to find people. Like people told me, when I was early on, that if you are doing a startup, people who are buying your software really need to want your software. They say this about painkiller and vitamins kind of a thing, right? Everybody says painkiller, vitamin, but no one explains to you what that means.
What does that mean? Yeah.
Right. And what does that exactly mean?
Incidentally, the market for vitamins is actually several times larger than the market for painkillers. I mean, in the US,
right. In fact,
that analogy only goes so far.
And not only that, even if you start out selling painkillers, you eventually making a lot of money on vitamins.
That's right.
Basically, right? So I think perceptions change, because like you as a startup with no reputation is very different than, for example, I go to my Microsoft analogy. We used to think like these guys can sell bricks in a box.
Yes.
Right. And customers would buy us. Customer would basically write a check without even actually looking at the bill of material. Right. So I think those perceptions are different. So I would basically say is that understand the market in the sense that whom you are trying to sell to, and see one-on-one, can you sell them? Basically, right? Put yourself and that other person in the room and see if you can sort of sell them. And like, why would you sell them and why would they buy?
Good advice. So I'm gonna let's talk a little bit about the way that you sell and Duplo Cloud, and I'm going to get into a little bit of the pricing approach and how you're leveraging Immersa from a product usage standpoint. So let's talk a little bit about that. So just first kind of shape some of the understanding around how you came up with you've shared some of that feedback with me in the past. Like, how did you come up with the metrics, and how did you decide to price your software, and why do you set up the thresholds the way you did? I think those are really interesting insights that you shared with us.
Yeah. I think the first point is that I think there are a few parameters to pricing. I think the one and probably the most important one is what is the customer's alternative, basically, right? If they were to not buy your software, first is that they have to buy. I mean, obviously that's an assumption. That's when you have the pricing conversation. You can't have the pricing conversation before getting the customer to there. So the starting point is that if you're talking pricing, there's already good news, basically, right? So you have crossed majority of the barriers. So now if you're having the pricing conversation, you sort of say is that, okay, how much would they sort of pay if they were to not use that? So in our case, for example, the most common thing is that they'll have to hire a DevOps engineer or two, for example, right? So that's what you can do. There are some other softer ones. It's like, for example, okay, there is a speed, there is go to market, a speed, like how fast they can go, they can reduce their errors and whatnot. They can be more efficient, but these are like really soft metrics. And I would say they're almost traps. Basically, right? These are like very hard to justify. How do you like sort of quantify faster go to market, right? 1 month, 2 months, everybody says 50%. I mean, I don't know. I see these numbers, 50% savings, this X increase in this and that and whatnot. But I think at an early stage, it's harder. First, okay, how much would they pay you otherwise? Pay an alternative otherwise? Start with that. And then another thing that you as a business have to make sure is that if they are paying X, you as a software business, you need to have 80% gross margins. Right. This I have seen, working with a lot of young companies, they just don't have the product which can sell for the price point that it deserves in the market. Their price is like so much, the cost is so much higher. So that's another thing that you need to sort of take care of and sort of go from there. In the center. And that's where I think the painkiller versus vitamins come. When you're selling vitamins or you're at a stage of where you're selling vitamins, this is an easier conversation because it's anyways a vitamin, right? They're buying it because they have too much money, or rather they have money to buy vitamins, right? So then it's an easier conversation.
So, when you shared your pricing approach with us, you talked about how you had set the first tier of pricing at 50 VMs. Right. And you had some rationale. So take us through that thought process. That was very interesting.
Yeah. I think effectively, I'll tell you there were a few things that came to our mind. First is that the number of nodes or the number of VMs was something that the infrastructure industry understood, basically, right? Some people called it cores. Some people called it VM, some people called it services. That's something that they understood. Another thing that people understood is the number of users, basically, right? So that was another thing. So I think first thing what we wanted to do is that how do we tie our value that we are sort of like impact to the value. And what we sort of said is that I think our impact is on how much workload do we manage And how do we count the workload? We count the workload by the number of VMs. We could have said that, okay, you know what, we're going to start by measuring the number of users. But then the fact is about 40% of what the software does is offline and asynchronous. The user doesn't even have to be involved. So then that's not a fair metric. So then we sort of said, but again, I think that was one factor. The other factor is that we sort of had some idea about like, for this size of an infrastructure, that's when you would need one person. I say 1% to 50 VM, 100 VM, you need the second person and so on. So that's sort of the unit that we sort of created. And then we sort of went with that. And it's not like you won't be challenged with that. Sometimes we do get challenged, right? There would be a customer who would be like, you know what, I want PCI, but I want like only 10 VMs, basically. But that's an effort which is unrelated to the number of VMs, and you have to sort of go and explain it to them and whatnot. But I think fundamentally it comes down to what would they have done otherwise. They would have hired one person for 50 VMs, and then we sort of like went from there.
Yeah. So I think that to me was a pretty significant insight when you shared it with us. And the way that you think about pricing is that you're leveraging a model that the industry already understands. Like, when a hiring manager makes a decision on when to hire their next person, they're thinking in terms of number of VMs that have to be managed and the first VMs. Yeah. And that's where you set the threshold and said, look, if we're managing 50 VMs for you, you're paying X, and it's significantly less than if you have to go hire this person yourself. And I think that value proposition came through to us pretty loud and clear in our conversation. So
one more thing I can add over there is that, sometimes I think we got into this is that you don't have to optimize for an unlikely scenario. Like, for example, there would be some customer, you are early on, they'll be like, okay, what is my price for 300 VMs? And this model, if you study more closely, it may fall apart because it does not scale linearly, like even the hiring of the people and whatnot. Right. But the important thing is not to actually go and address that and create white papers and whatnot, because what are the chances in the first year that you're actually going to sell a 300 VM deal? Almost zero, right? Just focus on 50, maybe deal with 75 or deal with 100 and stop there and let you build credibility. And then there will be more data points that you will get that you may not know that come at 100 and 200 and whatnot, which don't appear at like 50 VM. They're like all sorts of different things. And then you can add it to the value. But in summary, I think if you can keep it simple as an early customer, you can sort of like be successful there.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so let's shift gears again. So let's talk about the Immersa relationship with Duplo. I mean, we're a customer to you, and you obviously took an early interest with us and took a bet on us. And in fact, as we're building the product, you're advising us alongside and how to build it in the right direction. What was the need that kind of prompted you to engage in a conversation as we approached you and started into a conversation with you? Like, help us understand. And I'm trying to tie this back to the vision that we talk about, or I talk about as leading up Immersa. Is like, I want to hear it from your lens. Like, how does it come across to you?
I think when we were early on, right, especially pre-Series A, so we were younger in terms of like our companies that we were working with were smaller companies, 50 VM, maybe 20, 25, 50, they were there more or less. There wasn't really as much of an upsell, for example, right, in that particular thing, right? I mean, there was almost no upsell like last year. And suddenly this year, we realized that we upsold like 30%. For example, right? And that is because we got established. Now we're getting close to like 80, 100 customers. And then these are like really big customers. And they go, some of them like go crazy, like 50. And suddenly I open the portal, Duplo Cloud portal, and then it's like they have like 200. Yeah. Ours is a software which is self-hosted that runs in customers' accounts. So we sometimes don't have visibility and engineers don't pay attention. Or at least it is not formalized. They're like not like salespeople or like the CEO who's incentivized to look at the node count. So the first thing that we wanted to do is that we wanted some sort of a centralized location where we can track our usage, for example, right? And then see the patterns around it and understand how people are using it so that we can go back to them and do upsells and whatnot. And now it is like, and then that's where after talking to Aman, we picked Immersa, and then we use all those metrics and the dashboard that we have. Like what we did is that we had to make a change in our product to basically send all information to Segment, and you guys sort of pick it up from Segment. And I was like pretty impressed how Aman was able to do that integration very quickly. I think when we came on board, they didn't have it. They were sort of exporting, but he did that, and then he put it in Snowflakes, and then we had all these dashboards, which we go there all the time. We integrated it Salesforce. Now we get notification whenever people exceed their stuff and whatnot. So that's how I think Immersa was sort of like has been very valuable. And I think some of the feedback that I was giving Aman is like, what are the other challenges that we have now beyond upsell, and how, you guys can help us and whatnot.
So I would love to hear about that. And I think the key point that you called out is you've seen 30% of your business move towards upsell this year, and that's where you needed some visibility into who those accounts are and sort of get in front of it as this was happening. And this is where Immersa stepped in to help you find that visibility and drive actions with your team. So that's pretty interesting. Now, before we go into what are the future opportunities, how would you quantify the value of what we've been able to do in the short time we've been working together? And I think, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think anything that you can share there really helps others to think about, where they might be able to get some value out of what the types of scenarios you're describing.
Yeah, I think one is that you can actually do things to sort of like get insights into your usage and stuff. But there is a lot of stuff that you have to sort of do to formalize the data that you get. Like you have to integrate it with Salesforce. You need to have like proper dashboard. You may have a lot of AEs who are not so technical. They can't, like, one could say that, okay, yeah, can I put it in Elasticsearch and just look at that? But do the AEs know how to run Elasticsearch queries, their dashboards and whatnot? I think in that sense, I think actually working with the Immersa team, we ourselves learned quite a bit about the RevOps part, basically. And I think we have both mutually benefited in the sense that we have given feedback to the Immersa team, and then the Immersa team has told us, look at this account this way, this account that way, and so forth. So it's almost like, in our case, again, I'm not super familiar with these terms, but Immersa could, in some form, is like our outsourced, RevOps.
Yeah.
Basically, right? So, and we rely on, like, we would basically reach out to Aman and so on, and then sort of say that, okay, how do we do this and so forth.
Got it. Cool. Okay, let's move on to some of the other use cases you have in mind. Like what are you thinking of where we could be working together in the future?
Yeah, I think in general, what I feel is that, like, I think the nodes and the usage is like, end of the day, what does somebody want, right? They really want like two things outside. One is that, okay, how is the business doing? In the sense, how is the customer? Is the customer happy? Is the customer successful, basically, right? And there are like a lot of like sort of granular metrics to that. I think like, okay, how many people are happy? How many people are unhappy? I mean, today is the time of Slack and whatnot. Then second is that, okay, their usage, purely the node usage, right? Then there is general usage patterns about the product and whatnot. Then there's also things like, okay, where things are breaking and so forth. And then all of this eventually gets tied to the financials aspect of it. Like, okay, let's say if you have in financials, you have upsells, then you have POCs. Okay, how are the POCs doing and whatnot? I mean, my sort of this dream vision is to have this one single solution where I could log in and I could get like all aspects of my business effectively, right? I mean, today it is not Salesforce. Today it is nowhere. Like I have to go to 10 places to find out, okay, first find out, go to ClickUp, find out the tickets, how many customers have pending stuff, go to Slack, who's happy, who's unhappy, go to Salesforce, find out what's happening with respect to, their usage and whatnot. And then maybe come to Immersa, look at the node usage. I think these things can definitely be combined. And sort of like what I tell Aman is that, QuickBooks is that thing for finance.
Right.
Basically, right? You can sort of go into QuickBooks and you can get everything, basically, right? And then eventually people can go and run. Is like, this is what I tell people. I've transacted $20 million of business on QuickBooks with no finance support. Just by myself, basically, right? Why? I think that's a brilliant software which actually allows you to do that, right? I mean, including raising funds and selling and buying and whatnot. I think what a lot of people sort of do in the RevOps space is that they're like, okay, I'm going to let you connect to this tool and that tool. And they sort of make an assumption that I'm using those tools and I love those tools, basically. Right. And I think there is a market for that. Like, definitely when you go to large enterprises, when you have like so many people with their own expertise and everything. But then, any revolution in as a service takes you a layer above, and you have to sort of think out of box. If you give them everything in a single place, I don't think people really care going to like these 50 places. Cloud has shown us that, right, with infrastructure as a service. And like I gave you the finance example and so on. And something has to be done for this whole, I don't know, business ops as a service or whatever. And it's not like that many things. And me and Aman talked about it. And I drew some taxonomy of like top 10 things I'm looking for.
No, it's brilliant and very aligned with the vision of where we're headed as a company. I think for us, it's been a huge learning year or the first year of the company to understand what the current state of the RevOps industry is and where things are at. And what we see is that gives me a lot of confidence of where Immersa is headed is, number one, there's massive amounts of data, but it is sitting in such fragmented systems that people really have no clue on how their business is really operating. And at every level, whether you're the founder, CEO, whether you're the head of sales, whether you're a AE or a customer success rep or a RevOps person, you're constantly trying to put all this data together to make sense out of it, to figure out how things are working. And then the second thing that we're a big proponent of, and we feel like is really critical, and this comes from both Aman and my personal frustration in our previous lives, where a lot of good insights get delivered through dashboards, but they don't actually lead to anything happening differently in the way that your teams are engaging with your clients, whether it's in pre-sales or post-sales, or doesn't matter what part of the customer funnel. And so to change that at an account by account level is sort of where our focus and a lot of our attention is to say, look, we can get you insights at an account level that help you change the conversation you're having with that account, because we can provide all of this from across all the different data sources.
What I have felt a theme is that after working for a lot of big companies, small companies and involved, why do things don't happen? What I feel is that things don't happen because there are too many people involved, basically, right? And then like, because there's too many people involved, they think this is their responsibility, this responsibility, they get siloed. Now, if you have to reduce the people, you can't just suddenly reduce the people, basically, right? So if you have to reduce the number of people and focus accountability in some people, you have to give a software underneath of that, basically, right? So what did Cloud do? Cloud basically said, okay, I'm going to give everything. I'm going to enable that one CTO to actually run his application end to end. So in the same way, I think if you can actually build a software that gives you full power to people and reduces the barrier to entry, right? For someone like me to actually transact so many $1 million on a QuickBooks, for example, right? Which allowed me. So if a software can actually do that, automatically a lot of these problems go away because the accountability settles down on fewer number of people, sometimes even one, and then they will be able to automatically make the difference.
Yeah, that is a really cool insight, and I think something that I think we're going to take it to heart as we build out Immersa. Okay, so I'm gonna take this to close. So, your story is brilliant as an immigrant to the U.S., a failed FANG interviewer, and then landed at Microsoft. And then over many years, sort of found yourself moving towards this entrepreneurial hat, and sort of just blossomed from there. And now, of course, DuploCloud's creating a new category with DevOps as a service. What's your advice to other entrepreneurs or founders or people who are considering becoming founders in terms of, there's thousands of challenges as you build a company, as I'm discovering as I go down this path for the first time myself. But what's your advice to other people who are considering going down this path? What would you advise them today? Just very succinctly, in a nutshell, what you've learned that you can share with them that'll help them in their journey.
I would basically say, especially if you're a first-time founder, right? I think stay close to the fundamentals, basically, right? And fundamentals in all aspects. If you're building a product, either you yourself or someone very close to you, a co-founder, really knows how to build the product and drive it end to end. If you are selling and you understand the customer, you really need to put yourself in their shoes and then sort of sell. And I think if you can make a small unit work, I think things will automatically work out and you can sort of scale it up to make this thing work. Sometimes, when we have a big picture and grand visions in mind, we lose sight of fundamentals.
Yes.
And that's where I think sometimes we might actually go wrong. And in that extent, I would basically say, if you can sort of get yourself established before you talk to investors who always have grand visions in mind, fairly so, because that's what their business is, that might potentially help.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. Venkat, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your insights, your journey, your thoughts, and advising. I'm sure there's going to be so many nuggets coming out of this for people who are watching this and listening to this. I know you're a pretty accessible guy, so best place to find you, LinkedIn?
Yeah, LinkedIn. Yeah, you can.
So you can find Venkat on LinkedIn. In Immersa perspective, we're always willing to have conversations with folks about the future of RevOps, the future of business intelligence that's operationalized. So give us a shout. We're at immersa.ai, or you can find Asim at LinkedIn, and look forward to continuing this conversation from here on forward. Venkat, thank you so much for placing your bet with us and trusting us.
Thank you.